Elvis Costello joins me in Studio Q. Thank you for being here.
Well, I feel like I must have come home, and that's the most extraordinary selection of music I've ever been welcomed with.
Kudos to our team there with the montage.
No, very good montage. I'm used to. I've just come from England, where they think I died in 1981. So it's like they usually play something quite different. That's quite the selection.
Well, we had the Roots collaboration off the top there.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to start with something that's relatively recent for a change, because obviously, you end up writing a book like this length. You try to find a way how you got to the things I've done even fairly recently, as well as all the other adventures.
Yeah. Take me to where your dad played, the Hammersmith Palais. He was a musician. He was also a singer.
Yeah.
Take me to the Saturday afternoons when you were allowed to go along. And
yeah, well, he started out as a bebop trumpet player, but then, like a lot of jazz musicians, found it difficult to make a living, particularly with a young family. And 1955, he got the best in a number of jobs he'd had, at first as a trumpet vocalist, and gradually they made him into just a singer. And he sang until the late 60s with the Joe Loss Orchestra. So Saturday afternoons, I would say, my mother would get me out of the house. So probably I wouldn't get under her feet while she's trying to clean the house, and send me to work with my dad. And again, it's not a scene that you can imagine today. They would open up the dance hall for 30, maybe as few as 30 patrons. Hammersmith Palais was a really famous venue. Everybody of a certain age talks about going there Friday night, Saturday night to dance and court and everything. But in the afternoons, they would just have a matinee performance and the full band playing and everything. And the balcony was completely deserted. I'm sort of, the first time I went there, I was about 7 years old. And I'm sitting, my dad would put me up there with a bottle of pop, as we call it, and a bag of crisps, and don't move, and the woman from the coat check would have to keep an eye on me. But it's a very vivid memory. You see everybody in these shiny jackets and the saxophones and everything, and my dad would be on the end, mostly just playing Latin percussion, because they had mostly ballroom dancing groups that are practicing, and then a couple of little old ladies and dancing together, because they wouldn't go in the evening because it'd be too busy, and a mother teaching her daughter to dance. It was a very sweet scene when I think of it. I mean,
how did it affect the way you related to music as a kid, to have a father that was in the business?
I think it sort of made it seem like I used to go along with him to the radio theatre. They used to broadcast on the BBC, and I'd go on my school holidays with him, 9 a.m, maybe even earlier than that, and watch a bunch of men like reading the paper. And it seemed very much like a factory. They were just talking, and then somebody would come and say, "Okay, now time to rehearse," and then the light would go on, and what had seemed a very mundane scene would suddenly turn into music. And I saw that repeated over and over, and they would even have groups from the Hit Parade come on and do a guest appearance. So that was magical for me, because I would see a bunch of scruffy young men stagger in, and probably having driven through the night to get to London to do a broadcast. And then they would go backstage and put on their suits and come out with their guitars.
And be very professional.
And they would be the Hollies or some group from the Hit Parade. And it was, of course it was a thrill to see these people that I liked up close. And that was the way that they had themselves heard, as guests on these, I suppose you would call them more like a variety show.
Your relationship to music changed a little bit later after a terrible accident. Your friend Tony was struck by a car and killed. How did that change the way you saw music in your life?
Well, like a lot of teenagers, I was pretty self-righteous and had all sorts of odd ideas about music being above and beyond commerce and it not being necessarily my occupation. I watched my dad be in it, and I'd seen the good and bad of that. My parents split up, but that wasn't something that I really didn't analyze, but I guess it must have had some impact on me.
On a subconscious level, did that kind of scare you about going into music professionally?
When I wrote about it in the book, I sort of came to the conclusion I must have had some trepidation about it, of being, leading me down a path that, I didn't necessarily follow that would be like my dad. He wasn't much good at being a conventional dad, but we loved him nonetheless. All me and my younger half brothers, 4 of them, had a similar experience in the sense that he wasn't really very good at the ordinary dad things, but the things he gave us, the love of music and the sense of fantasy and imagination, was irreplaceable. Certainly that horrible experience of my friend being killed right before us when I was just 17. At that age, it had a very deep impact. I just gave up studying. I didn't want to go to college. I thought, well, maybe I'd best do the thing I really love most, and maybe I can make it into a living. I had no way of knowing how to do that. And it took me a few years to work out exactly,
How
how to raise your voice enough to get people's attention. At first I was, at that time I was singing songs that were, I suppose I admired a lot of American singer-songwriters, and what I left out of my analysis of their music was that they had earned the right for people to be quiet when they were singing. And of course, when you went to the local club and tried to do that, people just talk all over you. So I had to learn how to sort of stand up for myself.
And
a
you
little
can't
bit.
fake that. That just takes time.
No, because it was I don't know, whoever it was, the songwriters of that time. There were two or three different threads of music going on in the early 70s. There was the very bombastic, prog rock and hard rock, and then there was the intimate singer-songwriters with the acoustic guitars, and I went towards those. Being a teenager, maybe I felt that was more the way I felt. But it took me a while to realize that my natural disposition was actually quite a lot more aggressive than that. And once I started to give some hint of my true nature and be more emphatic in the way I sang it, that I started to sing like that around the time that almost a lot of people in London started to sing like that in different ways. And I managed to, have the good fortune to walk into a small record company who were looking for oddballs and people that didn't fit in anywhere else. I'd already had my tapes returned to me, with fairly curt notes from major record companies. Nobody was interested in, because I didn't look like anybody's idea of a pop star or a rock and roll singer,
You write about the magic of attempting to do that, attempting to emulate your influences, and actually missing the mark, and that actually being the magic. Can you describe that?
Can be, I'm pretty certain that songs that where I've had a very definite idea. I'm absolutely writing a song now that's supposed to be like, I don't know, Curtis Mayfield or Dusty Springfield or George Jones or all these high-flown people that I couldn't sing anything like. And in the failure to sing like them, I sing like me. That's the way it happens. And that's the way everything has happened. Is in just reaching for something that's out of you shouldn't. Why would you try to imitate something that's terrible? What would be the point?
How much are you deliberately trying to retain some essential Elvis Costello when you're working in collaboration with somebody else?
I don't actually have a sort of a preconceived idea of what that is, because I think you should be changing all the time as you gather experience. I mean, it's not that you're not wrapped in muslin like an old piece of cheese, getting gradually kind of moldier. But
Yeah.
I don't really know what it is you're supposed to be doing. There's no rule book for doing, I mean, the music that I started out in was presumed to be young people's music. Classical music you could grow old in, painting you could grow old in, jazz even you could apparently grow old in. It did, that we still have a few of the really greatest musicians playing. Rock and roll, it was assumed that wouldn't necessarily be, but look where we are now. There's people much older than me that are playing. I'm only 60. I'm relatively young. If you look at Chuck Berry is still playing, Jerry Lee Lewis is still playing, the Rolling Stones are on the stage. I saw Bob Dylan a week ago play a sensational show, and you wouldn't limit the description of him being a rock and roll singer, would you? He's every kind of music. But
when you started, it was assumed that there was a kind of shelf life to a rock and roll.
Yeah, but I never really. My model for a life in music had been that my grandfather had played since it had got him out of the circumstances of his own childhood, which was that of an orphan. It had got him out of an orphanage into the army. He got out of the army onto the ocean liners and sailed to America through the 1920s. I mean, this was an expectation that a lad from a little town on the Mersey opposite Liverpool could not have had. Most people that traveled to America in those days didn't come back. They just came and made a new life doing whatever they did, shining shoes, working in a shop, going down a mine, building railroads, whatever they did, He had a pretty good life for 10 years doing that. My father, had a life in music from the age of 21 to the 90s, I mean, he made a living all his life. I've made a living doing this, so
that's always how you approached it.
It's just a job in one respect. Well, all the other things that I've learned and that I value, the other side of it is my occupation to do this. I've worked every day I did other jobs briefly for about 5 years in order to finance, the efforts to play music. And from the age of 22 on, I've been living on my wits.
For someone who admires so many musicians, you've been dogged by one personal lapse that you write about in this book. You got into an argument with some fellow musicians at a bar in Ohio. You used a racial slur in reference to Ray Charles and James Brown. What did you want to say about that in this book?
Well, I think I try to choose my words. It's one of the shorter chapters, not because it means less to me, but because it means more to me. And it's always very difficult to excerpt what you said. I'm not just saying this so you go and buy the book, but I mean it is. I tried to lay it out that the frame of mind that you could possibly be in, where you would say the exact opposite of what you believed in an attempt to be, I guess, ironic. I mean, if you're that off your face, which I certainly was. I think you can talk yourself into the logic that people can read your mind, and I'm kidding, right? I'm being outrageously like good is bad kind of speech. Yeah. And of course, I have no idea what the motivation of the people who then brought a very stupid and ignorant bar fight into the public domain. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they felt justified in unmasking a bigot, But as I said in the book, judge me by the rest of my actions. Where's the suggestion that I actually harbor those thoughts in anything else I've done, in any of the rest of the time I've been alive, in every other alliance I've ever made in music? I'm not offering an apology in that sense. I've apologized in the in the sense of people not understanding me, but then there's people who had their own reasons for wanting to take out of those events what they chose to see. Mm-hmm. People who actually I allegedly spoke of had much more grace and forgiveness, you have to say. And I have to say, I probably faced much worse.
Well, you write in the memoir,
some drunk in a bar in Ohio.
You write in the memoir that time in Ohio may have saved your life.
Well, in some unworthy way, yes, it probably did, because I wasn't if you get to the state where you're literally speaking the opposite of your feelings and you're not in control of your tongue, then you're in a pretty dangerous you're in dangerous territory. Yeah. And too much attention, too much sense of entitlement, too much of everything really is a very familiar, not very glorious, not very noble story, and we've seen it lots of times. And I thought I was a little smarter than that. I was disappointed in that sense in myself.
But it knocked you onto a different course, a better course?
It just did. I mean, It did. Obviously, there was a line that people had laid out for me that it was going to go off in this big trajectory, and I don't know that I would have necessarily done so well with playing in the big arena. I guess I had in terms of numbers, bigger hits after that happened. But it didn't, at that point, it didn't sort of like blow my life up in the way it might have done if it just kept going in this big rocket ship,
You felt like personally you weren't at a place to be able to handle that type of success?
I didn't really like it that much. I didn't like it that much anyway. I never did. I'm just not very good at people more marching in step. I tend to like the kind of slightly off thing. When it starts to go too well, I'll find somewhere to drive the car off the road,
I can't let you go without asking you about lyrics. Uh-huh. What does it feel like when you arrive at the right lyric, at a great lyric? What's that feeling like?
I don't think there's a moment of self-satisfaction about it. It has to be recognition, otherwise you'd keep tinkering. Mm-hmm. And it can be everything from the relief of finding where a thought that you buried in a notebook 5 years ago magically joined up with a bunch of other thoughts, and it came to some kind of coherence along with some music that makes it feel something. That happened on a number of occasions. I mean, there's a song at the end of the soundtrack record, which is the word for the compilation that I assembled to accompany this book. I tried to put some of the songs on it that people maybe didn't know so well, along with some of the best-known songs, and included a song from 1975, which was some of the lyrics. If you know my songs well, you'd recognize some of the lines as being in the song Watch Your Step. But I had to wait all that time from 75 to 80, 5 years, for those couple of lines that survived to find the company in a coherent thought that I wanted to put on a record, or had the opportunity by then to put on a record. Other times, songs will appear completely fully formed. The whole song will have words and music. That's pretty startling when that happens. And I've described it happening with the song, with relation to the song "Angels Wear My Red Shoes," but equally in more recent times, "Jimmy Standing in the Rain" appeared in that way, very vividly. The whole story like a movie in my head. 6 songs from the album Brutal Youth in one afternoon. I mean, that was to the point that was actually a bit upsetting, you know, when that happens. And every time I picked up the guitar, something was happening. Sometimes in the time between waking and sleep, you seem to be open to this. I wrote several of the melodies for the new Basement Tapes record in about an hour-long period one night like that. The melodies just appeared in my head because I'd been reading these Bob Dylan lyrics that we'd been given to set. And
bubbling in your
I didn't sit down with
subconscious
the guitar. I had my hand bound up from a procedure, and I couldn't play the guitar. So I had to just mumble the melodies and then find a way to play them one-handed on the piano the next day. It's a very extraordinary sort of scene, you know.
Amazing.
One mitt all bound in bandages and the other one playing these melodies and going, that actually is a tune. I haven't heard it before.
Well, thank you so much. Fascinating.
Thank you.